Ada stood by the window of her new home, gazing out at the village beneath the setting sun. The wedding had been beautiful, the kind of celebration she had always dreamed of. Obi, her new husband, had looked handsome in his suit, his smile warm and full of promise. But now, as they entered their new home, something felt off. Her excitement turned to unease as Obi didn't seem to share her joy. He moved around the house in silence, barely acknowledging her as she set down her bags and adjusted the curtains. When she finally spoke, trying to make small talk, he gave her a stiff nod and retreated into the bedroom. A cold chill settled over Ada. She followed him, hoping to ease his nerves, but Obi was already lying on the bed, staring at the ceiling with a strange, distant look in his eyes. "Aren't you happy?" she asked, her voice soft with concern. Obi turned his head slightly, his eyes still vacant. "I am. It's just been a long day." Ada smiled weakly, trying to shake the feeling that something was wrong. But as the hours passed and the night deepened, the coldness between them remained. In the days that followed, the distance between them grew. Obi was always in the house, yet seemed to be everywhere but present. He sat at the table with his eyes glued to a book but didn't speak a word. He ate without a word, his face expressionless. Ada tried to engage him, asking about his day and his thoughts on their future, but he gave only brief responses, his mind somewhere else. The odd behavior was starting to wear on her. She tried to tell herself it was just the stress of the wedding, but it didn't feel right. Whenever she touched his hand, it felt like a stranger's. The warmth she had once felt for him was fading, replaced with a sense of unease. Late one evening, Ada found herself staring at Obi's back as he stood by the window, looking out into the night. She couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't the same person she had married. Ada couldn't help but wonder what had happened to the man she had fallen in love with. The Obi had been charming, loving, and full of life. This new version of him felt like a shadow of that person. She began to notice little things, small habits he had once had that had vanished. He no longer smiled, no longer laughed. The warmth in his eyes was replaced with something dark and unsettling. One morning, she realized his lucky charm, a small pendant he always wore, was missing. She searched the house but couldn't find it. The charm had been a gift from his grandmother, and she knew how much it meant to him. Yet now, it was gone, as if erased from existence. Ada couldn't ignore the nagging feeling any longer. One afternoon, while walking through the village market, she encountered an elderly woman who had known Obi's family for years. "You've married into a powerful family," the woman said cryptically, her eyes sharp and knowing. "Be careful with him. Some families are not what they seem." Ada was taken aback. "What do you mean?" "Obi is a good man. I love him." The woman's face hardened. "Not everything is as it seems, my dear. Watch him carefully. People change. And sometimes, the changes are not for the better." The woman's words echoed in Ada's mind as she walked home, but she brushed them off. It was just an old woman's superstition, she thought. Yet, deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Night after night, Obi withdrew further into himself. He no longer seemed to sleep peacefully, tossing and turning in the dark. Ada lay beside him, feeling the coldness in the bed grow as he stared blankly at the ceiling. She reached out to touch him, hoping to offer comfort, but he recoiled, pulling away from her touch. One night, as Ada lay awake, she heard a low muttering from Obi's side of the bed. She strained to listen, but the words were incomprehensible. It sounded like a language she had never heard before. She turned to face him, but his eyes were closed, and he seemed deep in sleep. The unease in Ada's heart grew. Was he speaking in his sleep, or was something else at work? Determined to uncover the truth, Ada began to quietly investigate Obi's past. She spoke to the few villagers who still knew his family, hoping to learn more about him. What she uncovered sent a chill down her spine. Obi's family had always been shrouded in mystery. His father was a quiet, reserved man who had died under strange circumstances. Some villagers spoke in hushed tones about the family's involvement in old spiritual practices, rituals that some believed were linked to dark forces. Ada couldn't bring herself to believe it. Obi had always been kind to her. But the more she learned, the more she began to question who he was. As Ada continued to dig deeper, she began to notice something strange. Several villagers who had once been close to Obi's family had either disappeared or moved away. No one would speak openly about it, but there was an undeniable connection between their departure and Obi's family. One evening, Ada confronted a woman who had known Obi's mother. "Where did the others go?" Ada asked, her voice shaky with fear. "What happened to them?" The woman looked around nervously before whispering, "People don't live here unless they're forced. Those who got too close to the family, they were never seen again." Ada's heart raced. She had to find out what was going on before it was too late. One stormy evening, Ada lay in bed, the wind howling outside. She was just about to fall asleep when she heard it, whispers. Soft, raspy voices that seemed to come from all directions. At first, she thought it was the wind, but the voices were too distinct. They spoke her name. Ada. Her heart skipped a beat. She turned toward Obi, who was still lying beside her, but his eyes were wide open, staring into the dark. "Obi," she whispered. He didn't respond. Instead, he turned his head slowly toward her, his gaze empty, as if he was no longer the man she had married. Ada's breath caught in her throat as she realized he wasn't alone. There was something else in the room with them. That night, Ada had a vivid dream. In it, she saw Obi, but he was no longer the man she knew. His face was twisted, contorted in pain, as he stood in front of a large altar. Strange symbols were etched into the ground around him, and dark shadows moved at the edges of the room. Ada wanted to scream, but she couldn't. She was frozen in place, watching as Obi chanted words in a language that sent chills through her bones. The shadows closed in on him, wrapping around him like a cloak. Then, with a final scream, he was consumed by the darkness. Ada woke with a start, her heart pounding in her chest. It had felt so real. The dream had shaken her to her core. Was it just a nightmare, or a vision of something far more sinister? The next morning, Ada could no longer ignore the growing fear that had taken root inside her. She had to confront Obi and demand the truth from him. "Obi," she said, her voice trembling, "what is happening to you? Why are you acting like this?" Obi looked at her, his eyes cold and distant. He opened his mouth to speak but stopped. His lips curled into a slight, unsettling smile. "You never understand what I've become," he said softly, his voice carrying an edge that made Ada's blood run cold. Ada's heart sank as she realized that the man she had married was slipping away from her, and whatever had taken hold of him was far darker than she could have imagined.